The church doors closed with a sound like thunder, and I stood on the wrong side of them. Through the stained glass, colored light painted the sidewalk in blues and golds, while organ music leaked out like a secret I wasn't allowed to hear. My grandfather's funeral was happening without me, and my father had made sure of it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sofia Chen, and until 3 days ago, I thought I understood my family. I thought I knew where I stood in the careful hierarchy my father had built around his disappointments and his pride. I thought I knew why he looked at me the way someone looks at a mistake they're too polite to mention. I was wrong about all of it. The morning started with frost on the windows of my studio apartment in Cedar Falls, the kind of October cold that makes you remember summer like a story someone told you once. I was finishing my second cup of coffee when the phone rang. The caller ID showed my Aunt Helena's number, and I almost didn't answer. Helena only called when someone was dead or getting married, and since I hadn't received any wedding invitations lately, I knew which one it was. Sofia. Her voice sounded like she'd been crying for hours. Grandpa Luis passed last night. The coffee cup slipped from my hands and shattered on the kitchen tile. Brown liquid spread across the white linoleum like spilled ink, and I watched it seep into the grout while Helena's words tried to find a place to land in my mind. Grandpa Luis. The man who taught me to whistle through my teeth and tie knots that would hold through any storm. The man who called me his little navigator because I always knew which way was north, even in the dark. When's the service? I asked, already mentally calculating the drive time back to Millbrook. Helena's pause lasted too long. Sofia, honey, your father said you're not welcome. The words hit like cold water. What do you mean I'm not welcome? He was my grandfather. I know, sweetheart. I tried to talk sense into Marcus, but you know how he gets. He says after what happened with the restaurant, after you walked away from everything he built, you gave up your right to family ceremonies. I sank onto my couch, the one I'd bought secondhand when I first moved to the city. The springs complained under my weight, a sound like old bones settling. Helena, that was 2 years ago. I thought we were past this. Honey, I don't think your father knows how to be past anything. After I hung up, I sat in the growing puddle of coffee and remembered the last time I'd seen my grandfather. It was at the hospital 6 months ago, when the doctors first started using words like quality of life and making arrangements. I'd driven down on a Tuesday because my shifts at the bookstore gave me flexibility my siblings didn't have with their corporate jobs. Grandpa Luis had been sitting by the window in his hospital gown, watching sparrows fight over crumbs someone had scattered on the ledge outside. Sofia, he'd said, using the nickname he'd given me when I was 4 and couldn't pronounce my own name properly. Come sit with an old man. I'd pulled the visitor's chair close to his bed, and he'd taken my hand in his. His fingers were thinner than I remembered, the skin translucent as tissue paper, but his grip was still strong. Your father came by yesterday, he'd said, not looking away from the sparrows. He's worried about you. He's angry with me, I'd corrected. There's a difference. Grandpa Luis had smiled then, the same crooked smile I'd inherited. Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who understand us least. We'd sat in comfortable silence while the sparrows performed their tiny dramas outside the window. Then he'd squeezed my hand and said something I didn't understand at the time. Remember, little navigator, the treasure isn't always where you think you buried it. Now, sitting in my apartment with coffee soaking through my socks, I wondered if he'd been trying to tell me something. But it was too late to ask him, and my father had made sure I wouldn't get the chance to say goodbye. I called my sister Carmen first. She answered on the first ring, which meant she was avoiding work. Sofia, I'm so sorry about Grandpa, she said before I could speak. And I'm sorry about Dad being Dad. You knew he banned me. I found out this morning when I called to ask what flowers to bring. Marcus said the family had already been decided. Carmen's voice carried the careful neutrality she'd perfected as the middle child. I tried to change his mind. What did he say? He said you made your choice when you abandoned the family business to play bookstore. The family business. Chen's Garden, the restaurant my grandfather had built from nothing after immigrating from Taiwan in 1962. The place where I'd spent every weekend and summer of my childhood, learning to fold dumplings and take orders and smile at customers even when they mispronounced our name. The place my father expected me to inherit and run until I died, just like he had, just like his father before him. Except I'd walked away 3 years ago to study literature and work in a bookstore that smelled like old paper and coffee. I'd chosen words over wonton soup, stories over the family story, and my father had never forgiven me for it. Carmen, I need to be there. He was my grandfather too. I know, honey, but you know how Dad gets when he feels like his authority is being challenged. Maybe it's better if you just remember Grandpa in your own way. After Carmen hung up, I tried calling my brother Leo. He was at his law firm, speaking in the clipped tone he used when he was trying to sound important. Sofia, this is really bad timing. The funeral is family only, and you know the situation with Dad. Leo, please, I just want to say goodbye. Look, I get it, but picking a fight at Grandpa's funeral isn't going to fix anything between you and Dad. Sometimes you have to know when to let things go. Let things go, as if my relationship with my grandfather was something I could just set aside like a book I'd finished reading. As if 25 years of Sunday dinners and birthday cards and bedtime stories could be erased because I'd chosen my own path, instead of the one laid out for me. I hung up on Leo and stared at my phone. 3 siblings, 3 rejections, the message was clear, I was alone in this. That's when I remembered Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson had been my grandfather's neighbor for 30 years, the kind of woman who brought casseroles to new families and remembered everyone's birthday. She'd also been the one to find my grandfather when he fell in his kitchen last spring, and she'd ridden with him in the ambulance because my father was in meetings and couldn't be reached. I found her number in my old contacts and called before I could lose my nerve. Sofia dear, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I was hoping you'd call. I heard about your grandfather, and I'm so sorry for your loss. Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll understand why. My father has banned me from the funeral, but I need to say goodbye to Grandpa Luis. I was wondering if you might know another way. The pause that followed made me think I'd overstepped, but then Mrs. Patterson spoke with the quiet authority of someone who'd lived through 8 decades of human foolishness. That man raised you from diapers when your mother was working double shifts, she said. If Marcus thinks he can keep you from paying your respects, he's got another think coming. The church has a side entrance through the fellowship hall. I have a key because I coordinate the flower arrangements. Be there at 9:45 tomorrow morning, and wear something dark. Mrs. Patterson's plan was simple. She would prop open the fellowship hall door, and I could slip in through the back of the sanctuary just before the service started. The church would be full, and in the confusion of people finding seats, one more person wouldn't be noticed. I could sit in the back pew, listen to the service, and leave before anyone realized I'd been there. It wasn't perfect, but it was a chance to say goodbye, and that was all I needed. I drove through the night to get to Millbrook, taking the back roads I'd memorized during high school when staying out past curfew required strategic route planning. The familiar landscape rolled past in the darkness, cornfields stubbled with harvest, farmhouses with their porch lights on like earthbound stars. The water tower with class of 98 inches, spray painted on the side in fading blue letters. Millbrook hadn't changed much in the 3 years since I'd left. The same struggling downtown, the same mix of old families and new developments, the same sense that time moved differently here, like honey poured slowly from a jar. I parked at the 24-hour diner on Route 9 and tried to sleep in my car, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandfather's face. At 9:30 the next morning, I was standing outside St. Mary's Catholic Church in the black dress I'd worn to my college graduation. Mrs. Patterson appeared at the fellowship hall entrance exactly on time, wearing a burgundy cardigan and the expression of someone about to commit a righteous crime. "Quickly, dear," she whispered, holding the door open, "the family's already seated, and Father Mackenzie will start any minute." I slipped through the fellowship hall, past tables set up for the reception that would happen after the service, past bulletin boards covered with church announcements and pictures of the youth group's mission trip to Guatemala. The smell of coffee and old hymnals filled the air, mixed with the waxy scent of the lilies someone had arranged in tall vases by the altar. The sanctuary door opened with a whisper, and I found myself at the back of a church full of people who had known my grandfather. The casket sat at the front, surrounded by flowers, and for a moment the reality of it hit me like a physical blow. He was really gone. The man who had taught me to drive in the church parking lot on Sunday afternoons was never going to call me his little navigator again.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I slid into the last pew just as Father Mackenzie approached the pulpit. From where I sat, I could see my family in the front row. My father's shoulders were rigid with the kind of control that costs something to maintain. Carmen sat beside him, her hand on his arm. Leo had positioned himself at the end of the row like a sentry. None of them turned around. Father Mackenzie spoke about my grandfather's life with the practiced kindness of someone who had buried half the town. He talked about Louis Chen's journey from Taiwan to America, about building a business from nothing, about raising a family who honored his memory. It was all true and all carefully sanitized, the official version of a life lived. Then Father Mackenzie said something that made my heart skip. Louis left specific instructions for today's service, including a request that his granddaughter Sofia read a letter he wrote for this occasion. A murmur ran through the congregation. I saw my father's head snap up, saw him turn to scan the church. When his eyes found mine in the back pew, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and something else I couldn't identify. Father Mackenzie was looking around the sanctuary. Sofia Chen, if you're here, your grandfather wanted you to share his words with us today. Every person in that church turned to look at me. I felt exposed, pinned like a butterfly under glass, but I also felt something else. My grandfather's hand reaching across death to pull me back into the family circle. I stood on shaking legs and walked down the center aisle. My footsteps echoed off the stone walls, and I could feel my father's fury radiating from the front pew like heat from a furnace. When I reached the pulpit, Father Mackenzie handed me an envelope with my name written on it in my grandfather's careful script. I opened it with trembling fingers and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably his, and as I began to read aloud, I could hear his voice in every word. My dear Sofia, I read, my voice catching on his name for me. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are standing where I hoped you would stand when this day came. I know your father has his ideas about family and loyalty and the proper order of things. I know he believes I should have chosen differently when it came to my affections. But a grandfather's love doesn't follow the same rules as a father's pride. I paused, feeling the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on me. In the front row, my father had gone very still. I want everyone here to know that Sofia was not just my granddaughter, she was my favorite. The words landed in the sanctuary like stones dropped in still water. Not because she was smarter or kinder than her siblings, though she was both. Not because she shared my love of books and stories, though she did. But because she had the courage to choose her own path, even when that path led away from everything I had built. My voice was stronger now, carrying my grandfather's words to every corner of the church. I came to this country with nothing but the belief that my children and their children would have choices I never had. Sofia understood that. She understood that. She understood that the greatest gift I could give her was not a restaurant or a business, but the freedom to build her own life. The sanctuary had gone completely quiet. Even the babies had stopped fussing. I asked Sofia to read this letter not to cause pain, but to heal it. To her father Marcus, I want to say this: your daughter's courage is not a betrayal of what we built together. It is the proof that we built it well. We came to America so our children could become Americans, not so they could remain forever Chinese. Let her go, my son, and she will come back to you as herself. I looked up from the letter and found my father's eyes. For the first time in 3 years he was really looking at me, not through me or around me, but at me. I saw something in his face crack, just a little. And to my little navigator, I continued, reading the final paragraph. I want you to know that choosing your own direction doesn't mean you've lost your way. It means you've found it. The treasure isn't always where you think you buried it. Sometimes it's in the courage to dig somewhere new. I folded the letter and looked out at the congregation. Mrs. Patterson was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Carmen was crying openly. Leo looked like he'd been slapped with a truth he wasn't ready for. And my father was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. I walked back to the front pew, where my family sat in stunned silence. Without a word, Carmen scooted over to make room for me between her and my father. I sat down, and after a moment I felt my father's hand close over mine. Father Mackenzie continued with the service, but I barely heard the rest of it. I was thinking about my grandfather's words, about the treasure that isn't always where you think you buried it. I was thinking about the 3 years I'd spent believing my father's disappointment was permanent, that his love came with conditions I couldn't meet. After the service, we stood in the receiving line while half of Millbrook filed past to offer their condolences. Person after person stopped to tell me how much my grandfather had talked about me, how proud he'd been of my bookstore job, how he'd kept every letter I'd sent him. He had a whole photo album of your book recommendations, Mrs. Patterson told me. He'd show it to anyone who'd sit still long enough. When the line finally ended, my father and I found ourselves alone in the sanctuary while the rest of the family supervised moving the flowers to the reception hall. We sat in the front pew, neither of us speaking, while the afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows and painted us in shades of blue and gold. I didn't know he kept your letters, my father finally said. I didn't know he was proud of me, I replied. My father was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice sounded older, more tired. I thought I was protecting the family legacy. I thought if I let you go I'd lose everything he built. You can't lose something by setting it free, Dad. You can only lose it by holding too tight. He turned to look at me then, really look at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen in his face since I was a child. Recognition. Not disappointment or anger or expectation, but simple recognition of who I was. He really said you were his favorite. I smiled, feeling tears start again. He really did. My father reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package. He asked me to give this to you after the service. He said you'd understand what it meant. I unwrapped it carefully, peeling back layers of tissue paper until I found what was inside. My grandfather's compass. The same brass compass he'd carried from Taiwan, the one he'd used to teach me about true north and magnetic north, and the difference between where you're pointing and where you're actually going. Engraved on the back, in script so small I had to squint to read it, were the words for my little navigator. The treasure is wherever you choose to dig. I closed my fingers around the compass and felt its weight in my palm. It was warm as if it had been waiting for me all along. At the reception, I helped serve coffee and listened to story after story about my grandfather. How he'd learned English by watching game shows and reading cookbooks. How he'd saved for 3 years to buy the lot where Chen's garden stood. How he'd cried the day each of his grandchildren was born, not caring who saw him. But the story that mattered most came from Mrs. Patterson, who cornered me by the coffee urn with the determined look of someone who had news to share. Your grandfather asked me to tell you something if you came today, she said, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. He said to tell you that Chen's garden was never his real legacy. His real legacy was his family, and the part of his family he was most proud of was the part that had the courage to grow in its own direction. She paused, studying my face. He also said to tell you that if you ever wanted to come home, there would always be a place for you. Not at the restaurant, dear. Here, in Millbrook, with people who love you for exactly who you are. I looked around the church fellowship hall at the faces of people who had known me since I was born, at my siblings gradually warming back up to me, at my father learning how to see me again. I thought about my studio apartment in Cedar Falls, about the bookstore where I spent my days surrounded by other people's stories, about the life I'd built for myself in a place where no one expected me to be anyone but Sofia. For the first time in 3 years, I realized I didn't have to choose between them. The drive back to Cedar Falls took 4 hours, but I made it in stages, stopping at every small-town diner and roadside overlook along the way. I needed time to process what had happened, to understand how a single letter could change everything I thought I knew about my place in the world. My grandfather's compass sat on the passenger seat beside me, its brass surface catching the late afternoon sunlight. I picked it up at a rest stop outside Willow Creek, and watched the needle swing to magnetic north, steady and sure despite the movement around it. true north and magnetic north, where you're pointing and where you're actually going. Maybe the real treasure wasn't choosing between my family and my independence. Maybe it was finding a way to have both. When I got back to my apartment, I called my supervisor at the bookstore and asked for a week off. Then I called the only real estate agent in Millbrook and asked about rental properties near the town center. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, surrounded by the pieces of coffee cup I still hadn't cleaned up, and started making a list. It was a list of possibilities, of ways to bridge the gap between the life I'd built and the life I'd left behind. A bookstore in Millbrook, a weekly book club at the community center, a reading program for kids at the library. Small things, quiet things, but things that would let me come home as myself, instead of as the person everyone expected me to be. My phone rang as I was writing. The caller ID showed my father's name, and for a moment I hesitated, but then I remembered his hand closing over mine in the church pew, and I answered, "Sofia." His voice was different now, softer somehow. "I wanted to thank you for today, for reading his letter, for being there even when I tried to keep you away. I almost didn't come," I admitted. "I almost let your anger be bigger than my love for him. I'm glad you didn't." He paused, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "Your grandfather was right about me. I held too tight. I'm going to try to do better. Dad, I've been thinking, what if there was a way for me to come home without giving up who I've become?" Another pause, longer this time. "What did you have in mind?" I told him about my ideas, about the bookstore and the reading programs, and the possibility of building something new instead of just inheriting something old. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Dad, are you still there?" "I'm here," he said, and his voice sounded thick with something that might have been tears. "I'm just thinking about what your grandfather would say if he could hear this conversation." "What do you think he'd say?" "I think he'd say his little navigator finally figured out how to find her way home." That night I dreamed about my grandfather. He was sitting in his hospital room, watching sparrows outside the window, but this time I understood what he was trying to tell me. The sparrows weren't fighting over crumbs, they were teaching their young how to find food, how to survive, how to make their own way in the world. When I woke up, my grandfather's compass was on my nightstand, pointing true north. I picked it up and held it while I watched the sun rise through my apartment window, painting the sky in shades of possibility. The treasure isn't always where you think you buried it. Sometimes it's in the courage to dig somewhere new. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find out that home is big enough to hold both who you were and who you've become. I had a phone call to make to a real estate agent, and a life to build that would honor both my grandfather's legacy and my own truth. It was going to be the best kind of treasure hunt, the kind where everyone wins, and the map keeps changing, and true north is wherever you have the courage to call home. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, when the maples had finished their show and Millbrook looked like a town dressed in browns and golds. I stood in the doorway of my new apartment above Morrison's Hardware, watching three men carry boxes labeled books and kitchen up the narrow stairs that smelled like sawdust and old paint. Mrs. Patterson appeared with a casserole dish before the movers had finished unloading. She wore a powder blue coat and the expression of someone who had appointed herself the unofficial welcoming committee. "Tuna noodle," she announced, setting the dish on my kitchen counter. "And before you say anything polite about not needing to trouble yourself, let me tell you that feeding people is how women my age stay useful. You're doing me a favor." I smiled and accepted the casserole, along with a list of phone numbers she'd written on the back of an envelope. Doctor, dentist, plumber, electrician, and the woman who ran the best hair salon within 50 miles. Essential information for anyone planning to put down roots. "Your father's been by twice this week," she said, examining my sparse furniture arrangement with the eye of someone who decorated her share of homes. "Measuring windows, checking the heat register, making sure the locks work properly. He's nervous about you living alone above a hardware store." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that worrying about grown children is a father's job, but trusting them is his privilege." She adjusted one of my lamps, 2 inches to the left. Better light for reading that way. After she left, I unpacked my books first. Box after box of novels and poetry collections, biographies and cookbooks, field guides and atlases. The apartment had built-in shelves along one wall, and I arranged my collection with the care of someone setting up a shrine. These books had been my companions through graduate school, through late nights in the city, through the years when I'd felt caught between who I was and who everyone wanted me to be. The last box contained my grandfather's books, the ones my father had brought to me the week after the funeral. Chinese poetry volumes with tissue-thin pages, cookbook margins filled with his handwritten notes, and a leather-bound journal where he'd practiced writing English sentences. On the cover page, in careful script, he'd written, "Words are bridges between the heart and the world." I placed his journal on the shelf next to my compass, two pieces of inheritance that mattered more than money or property. Then I made tea in my new kitchen, and sat at my small table, looking out the window at Main Street while steam rose from my cup like incense. Millbrook moved at a different pace than Cedar Falls. People walked instead of hurrying. Conversations happened on sidewalks instead of in rushed phone calls. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop waved at me through my window, and I waved back, realizing it was the first time in 3 years that someone had waved at me just because they knew my face. The bookstore idea had started as a daydream, but it was becoming something more substantial with each conversation I had. The old Woolworths building on Main Street had been empty for 2 years, and the owner was motivated to find a tenant. The space was larger than I needed, but smaller than I could afford, which made it perfect for someone with more enthusiasm than capital. I spent my first week in Millbrook walking through the empty storefront, measuring spaces and imagining possibilities. High ceilings with decorative tin tiles. Original hardwood floors that creaked in harmony. Large windows that let in the kind of natural light that made books look like treasure. Carmen drove down from Springfield on Saturday with paint samples and the kind of sisterly excitement that comes from watching someone else take risks. "You're too practical to take yourself. You're really doing this," she said, running her hand along the old checkout counter that someone had left behind. "You're actually opening a bookstore in a town where the most popular reading material is the Walmart circular." "People read more than you think," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself. "They just need the right encouragement. And if they don't, if this fails, and you're stuck here with a lease you can't afford, and a business that doesn't work." I thought about my grandfather's compass, about the difference between true north and magnetic north. "Then I'll figure something else out, but at least I'll know I tried." Carmen nodded, understanding something in my voice that I was still learning to recognize. The sound of someone who had stopped asking permission to want what they wanted. We spent the afternoon sketching floor plans on the back of napkins, arguing about where to put the children's section and whether a coffee corner would attract customers or just create messes. By evening we had a vision that felt both ambitious and achievable, a bookstore that would also host readings, book clubs, and community events. A place where stories lived not just on shelves but in the connections between people who loved them. The bank appointment was scheduled for Monday morning. I wore my most professional outfit and carried a folder thick with business plans, financial projections, and letters of recommendation from professors who still believed in my potential. The loan officer was a woman named Patricia Valdez, who had the reputation for being fair but not foolish with the bank's money. She reviewed my paperwork with the thoroughness of someone who had seen plenty of dreams crash against the rocks of reality. Small business loans were risky enough without adding the challenges of a bookstore in a small town. But something in my presentation must have convinced her, because after an hour of questions and calculations, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Your grandfather banked here for 40 years, she said. "He had a saying that I still remember, the best investment is in something that feeds the soul." I think he'd approve of this venture. The loan approval came with conditions and restrictions, monthly reporting requirements and insurance obligations that made my head spin. But it also came with a handshake and a set of keys, and the understanding that I now had 6 months to prove that Millbrook was ready for an independent bookstore. My father helped me move the first shipment of books, though he grumbled about the weight of the boxes and questioned my decision to stock so much poetry. We worked in companionable silence, creating piles sorted by genre and age group, while afternoon light slanted through the windows and made dust motes dance like tiny celebrations. You know what this place needs, he said, surveying the growing organization of my inventory. Better lighting, more shelving, a customer base. A good name. He picked up a volume of Pablo Neruda and flipped through it with the careful attention of someone who didn't often handle books, but respected their importance. Every business needs a name that tells people what to expect. I'd been thinking about this question since I signed the lease, considering options that ranged from the practical to the whimsical. The corner bookstore, Millbrook Books, Page Turner. Nothing felt right, nothing captured what I was trying to build. What would you call it? I asked. My father set down the Neruda and looked around the space with an expression I was learning to recognize. The look of someone trying to see the world through his daughter's eyes instead of his own expectations. The Navigator, he said finally. Because books help people find their way. I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition that went deeper than approval. My grandfather's nickname for me transformed into something that honored both his memory and my independence. It was perfect in a way that made me understand how much my father had been listening, even when I thought he wasn't hearing me at all. The Navigator Books and Community Space opened on a cold Saturday in December with a ribbon-cutting ceremony that drew a crowd of about 30 people. Mayor Harrison made a speech about supporting local business, Mrs. Patterson brought cookies shaped like books, and my family stood in the front row wearing expressions of nervous pride. Carmen had driven down with her husband and their 2 kids, who immediately claimed the children's corner as their personal territory. Leo came with his wife and a bottle of champagne that cost more than my monthly utilities. My father brought my mother's old reading chair, the one she'd used during the evening hours when the restaurant work was done, and she could finally sit with a cup of tea and whatever novel had caught her attention. She always said every bookstore needed at least one perfect reading chair, he explained, positioning it near the window where the afternoon light was strongest. I thought you might want to carry on the tradition. I sat in the chair while the crowd browsed my carefully curated selection, and I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood, the sense of being exactly where I belonged, not because someone had told me this was my place, but because I had chosen it and built it and filled it with the things I loved most. The first month was harder than I'd expected. December brought snow and holiday shopping, but most people were focused on buying practical gifts from established stores. I sold enough books to cover my basic expenses, but not enough to feel confident about the future. There were days when I sat in my mother's chair for hours without a single customer, reading novels and wondering if Carmen had been right to worry. But something interesting started happening in January. People began staying longer when they did come in. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop discovered my collection of gardening books and spent an entire afternoon reading about soil composition and companion planting. The teenagers from the high school found my young adult section and turned the corner by the poetry shelves into an unofficial gathering spot. I started hosting events because I needed reasons for people to visit, but they succeeded because the community was hungrier for connection than I'd realized. The first book club meeting drew 6 people and a discussion of To Kill a Mockingbird that lasted until I had to turn off the lights. Poetry night attracted a surprising mix of regulars. Retired teachers, college students home for winter break, and a farmer named Jim who wrote haikus about weather patterns. The breakthrough came in February, during the winter storm that knocked out power to half the town. The Navigator had a generator and enough battery-powered lanterns to stay open, so I became an unofficial warming center for people whose heat had failed. I served hot coffee from a camping stove and encouraged everyone to browse while they waited for the electricity to come back. That's when I discovered that Millbrook had readers I hadn't known about. Serious readers who had been driving to Cedar Falls or ordering online because they assumed a small town couldn't support their literary tastes. By the time the power came back, I had a waiting list for special orders and enough word-of-mouth advertising to keep me busy for weeks. Spring brought new challenges and unexpected opportunities. The high school English teacher, Miss Rodriguez, asked if I'd be willing to host author visits for her advanced placement students. The community college in the next town wanted to partner on literacy programs for adult learners. The Historical Society proposed a series of talks about local history, with book sales to support their archive projects. Each yes I said added complexity to my simple bookstore dream, but it also added purpose. I wasn't just selling books anymore. I was creating spaces for the kinds of conversations that small towns often don't think they need until someone provides them. The most surprising development came in April when my father started dropping by on weekday afternoons. Not to help or check on me, but to browse. He'd discovered a section I'd created for business biographies and memoirs, and he was working his way through stories of entrepreneurs who had built something from nothing. "This guy started with a hot dog cart," he said one day, holding up a book about a man who'd eventually owned a chain of restaurants. "Reminds me of your grandfather and his first lunch counter." We started talking about family history in a way we never had before. My father shared stories about the early days of Chen's Garden, about the struggles and small victories that had shaped his understanding of success. I told him about the authors who had visited the store, about the book clubs where people shared parts of themselves they'd never spoken aloud. Slowly, carefully, we began building a relationship based on who we actually were instead of who we thought we should be. It wasn't the relationship I'd imagined as a child, but it was real in a way that felt more valuable than perfection. The one-year anniversary of my grandfather's death fell on a Tuesday in October. I closed the store early and drove to the cemetery with a book of Chinese poetry and my grandfather's compass. The maple tree over his grave had turned brilliant red, and the late afternoon light filtered through the leaves like stained glass. I sat on the ground beside his headstone and read poems aloud in English, wishing I could read them in his first language, but grateful that words could bridge the gap between memory and presence. When I finished reading, I set the compass on the stone and watched its needle settle toward magnetic north. "The treasure wasn't where I thought I'd buried it," I said to the quiet air. "It was in the digging itself." A year later, the Navigator was profitable enough to hire part-time help and expand into the storage room next door. I'd established a small press imprint for local authors and started a scholarship fund for high school students who wanted to study literature. The reading chair by the window was occupied more often than not, and the children's corner had become a destination for parents who wanted their kids to associate books with joy instead of homework. But the real measure of success wasn't in the financial reports or customer counts. It was in the moment when Mrs. Patterson told me that her book club had given her a reason to look forward to Thursdays again. It was in watching Jim the farmer share his weather haikus with a group of city visitors who were amazed that poetry could grow in farmland. It was in the letter I received from a former customer who had moved to Chicago but still ordered books from me because, she wrote, "Shopping at the Navigator feels like coming home." My father and I had lunch together every Sunday now, a tradition that started accidentally and became intentional. We'd meet at Chen's Garden, where he'd insist on cooking for me and I'd bring whatever book I was reading. He'd gotten interested in fiction over the past year, working his way through novels he'd never had time for when business consumed all his attention. "Your grandfather would have loved this place," he said one Sunday, gesturing around my bookstore with a coffee cup in his hand. "He always said America was big enough for all kinds of dreams." I thought about that as I looked around the space I'd created. Shelves full of stories, corners designed for conversations, windows that let in light and let people see inside. It wasn't the dream my family had planned for me, but it was mine, and somehow that made it theirs too. The compass sat on my desk now, pointing steadily north while I worked on orders and event planning and the 100 small tasks that kept a business running. Sometimes I'd pick it up and remember my grandfather's words about true north and magnetic north, about the difference between where you're pointing and where you're actually going. I'd thought I was going away from my family when I chose books over restaurants, independence over inheritance. But I'd actually been going towards something bigger, the understanding that love doesn't require conformity, that honoring someone's legacy doesn't mean repeating their choices, and that sometimes the best way to come home is to leave and then return as yourself. The last customer of the day was a little girl named Emma, who came in with her grandmother every Friday after school. She had discovered the picture book section and had opinions about which illustrators understood colors best. Today she brought me a drawing she'd made, a bookstore with windows full of rainbows and a sign that said "The Navigator" in careful purple letters. "This is for you," she said, presenting the picture with the solemnity of someone offering a great gift. "Because my grandma says you make books feel like magic." I taped Emma's drawing to the wall behind my register, next to the photograph of my grandfather on the day he'd become an American citizen and the first dollar I'd earned as an independent business owner. A gallery of moments that had led me to this place, this life, this understanding that the treasure had always been the journey itself. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, dusting Main Street with the kind of gentle persistence that makes everything look clean and possible. I turned on the lamps throughout the store, making the navigator glow like a lighthouse in the gathering dusk. Through the windows, anyone passing by could see the warm light, the comfortable chairs, the walls lined with stories waiting to be discovered. I locked the door and walked upstairs to my apartment, where my grandfather's journal sat on my kitchen table next to my laptop and the plans I was developing for a summer reading program. Tomorrow I would open the store again and people would come in looking for books and find community. They would leave with stories and return with friends. This was what my grandfather had meant about the treasure not being where you think you buried it. I'd thought I was looking for independence, for the right to choose my own path, but what I'd found was something more precious, the ability to create a path that led not away from family, but toward a bigger understanding of what family could be. The compass on my bookshelf pointed north, steady and sure. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Millbrook in quiet beauty. And inside, surrounded by books and memories and the growing certainty that I was exactly where I belonged, I made tea and opened my grandfather's journal to read his careful English sentences about building bridges between the heart and the world. I was home. 5 years later, I stood in the same church where my grandfather's funeral had changed everything, but this time I was at the front by choice. The sanctuary was full again, though for a much happier reason. Carmen was getting remarried, and she'd asked me to do one of the readings. The morning light streamed through the stained glass windows in familiar patterns of blue and gold, and I could see faces in the congregation that had become dear to me over the years. Mrs. Patterson sat in the third row, wearing a hat with small purple flowers. Jim the poet farmer had cleaned up nicely in a dark suit, sitting next to Miss Rodriguez and her new husband. Even Patricia Valdez from the bank was there, smiling at me from across the aisle. My father sat in the front row where he'd sat 5 years ago, but everything about his posture was different now. Relaxed instead of rigid, present instead of guarded. He caught my eye and nodded slightly, the same encouragement he'd given me when I was 8 years old and nervous about my first piano recital. The reading Carmen had chosen was from The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, a passage about marriage that spoke of giving your hearts to each other while maintaining your individual identities. As I read the familiar words about standing together yet not too near together, I thought about how much I'd learned about that balance in my own life. After the ceremony, we gathered at Chen's garden for the reception. My father had insisted on catering it himself, and the restaurant looked beautiful with white tablecloths and centerpieces of yellow roses. The familiar smell of ginger and soy sauce mixed with the sweeter scents of wedding cake and champagne. I found myself in the kitchen with my father during a quiet moment, both of us taking a break from the celebration. He was arranging dumplings on a serving platter with the precision he'd perfected over decades, and I was refilling water pitchers with the efficiency I'd learned during my childhood summers here. "She looks happy," he said, glancing through the kitchen door at Carmen dancing with her new husband. "She is happy, second chances suit her." My father smiled, continuing his careful arrangement. "Second chances suit all of us, I think." It was true. Carmen had found love again after her divorce. My father had learned to see his children as they actually were instead of who he'd planned for them to be, and I had discovered that coming home didn't mean giving up the person I'd become. Leo appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie after an enthusiastic dance with his daughter. "Dad, people are asking for more of those spring rolls. And Sofia, Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you're bringing any new poetry books to the store next week." I laughed, remembering how different family gatherings used to feel when we were all performing versions of ourselves instead of simply being ourselves. "Tell her I ordered 3 new collections, including one by a poet from Taiwan who writes about immigration. She'll love that," Leo said. "You know she's been learning Mandarin, right? She wants to read grandfather's poetry in the original language." After Leo disappeared back into the party, my father and I worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The rhythm of preparation was familiar and soothing, a dance we'd learned together when I was young and had rediscovered as adults. Sofia, my father said eventually, I have something to tell you. Something in his tone made me look up from the water pitcher. What is it? I've been thinking about retiring. Not immediately, but within the next year or two. And I wanted to ask you something. He set down the platter and turned to face me fully. Would you consider taking over Chen's garden? The question hung in the air between us like incense. 5 years ago, this offer would have felt like pressure, like being asked to sacrifice my independence for the sake of family obligation. But now it felt different. Like a choice rather than an expectation. Dad, I love what I do at the Navigator. I'm not sure I want to run a restaurant. I know, he said quickly, and I'm not asking you to give up the bookstore. I'm asking if you'd consider doing both. The restaurant could partner with the bookstore. Literary dinners, cookbook clubs, readings by food writers. Your grandfather always said the best businesses serve both the body and the soul. I thought about the idea, while the sounds of the wedding reception drifted in from the dining room. Chen's garden and the Navigator, two different expressions of the same impulse to bring people together around the things that nourish them. Can I think about it? I asked. Of course, take all the time you need. I just wanted you to know that the door is open, and it doesn't require you to walk through it the same way I did. The conversation was interrupted by Emma, now 10 years old and still my most dedicated customer, who burst into the kitchen with her grandmother trailing behind her, Miss Sofia. My mom says you're going to have a storytelling contest at the bookstore next month. That's right. Are you going to enter? I already wrote my story. It's about a girl who finds a magic compass that helps her family understand each other. I exchanged a look with my father, both of us smiling at the unexpected wisdom of children. That sounds like a wonderful story, Emma. I can't wait to hear it. Later that evening, after the last guest had gone home and the restaurant had been cleaned and closed, I sat in my apartment above the hardware store, with my grandfather's compass in my hands. The needle pointed steadily north, as it always had, but I was thinking about something else he'd taught me, that true north isn't always the same as the direction you're currently traveling. I thought about my father's offer, about the possibility of expanding my life to include both books and food, stories and family recipes. It would be complicated, requiring more energy and organization than I currently devoted to just the bookstore, but it would also be a way of honoring both sides of my inheritance. The practical wisdom my father had learned through years of hard work, and the creative vision I'd developed through my own journey. The phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. It was my father, calling from his house across town. I forgot to tell you something, he said. After your grandfather died, we found a box of letters in his desk. Letters you'd written to him from college, and when you first moved to Cedar Falls, he'd kept every one. What did they say? Mostly they were about books you were reading, ideas you were thinking about, dreams you were developing, but there was something else. In almost every letter, you mentioned wanting to find a way to bring literature and food together. You talked about cafes, where people gathered to discuss novels, restaurants that hosted poetry readings, dinner parties centered around favorite books. I closed my eyes, remembering those letters and the young woman who had written them. She'd been full of ideas that seemed impractical at the time, dreams that didn't fit neatly into any career categories she could find. Dad, why are you telling me this now? Because I think your grandfather saved those letters for a reason. I think he knew that someday you'd be ready to make those dreams real. After we hung up, I sat with the compass and thought about the path that had brought me to this moment. The years of feeling torn between family loyalty and personal independence, the painful separation that had taught me who I was when I wasn't trying to be who others expected, the gradual building of a life that honored both my roots and my growth. Maybe my father was right. Maybe I was ready to attempt something bigger, something that would require both the practical skills I'd inherited and the creative vision I'd developed. A business that served food and fed souls, that brought people together around tables and stories. I spent the weekend researching successful combinations of restaurants and bookstores, reading about literary cafes in other cities, sketching plans for how the two spaces might work together. By Monday morning, I had the outline of an idea that felt both ambitious and achievable. The Navigator Literary Cafe would expand into the space next to the current bookstore, creating a restaurant that served breakfast and lunch along with evening events that combined food and literature. Cookbook clubs, where people cooked and discussed their results. Poetry dinners where each course was inspired by a different poem. Author readings where the writer's favorite dishes were served alongside their words. It would require a larger loan, more staff, and a level of complexity that sometimes made my head spin. But it would also create something unique in our region, a place where food and literature could nourish people simultaneously. I called my father on Tuesday morning with my answer. Yes, I said, but I want to do it my way, combining both businesses into something new. Tell me about your way, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I explained my vision for the Navigator Literary Cafe, describing how the bookstore and restaurant could work together to create experiences that neither could offer alone. He listened without interrupting, asking thoughtful questions about logistics and finances, and the practical challenges of running two connected businesses. Your grandfather would have loved this, he said, when I finished. He always believed that the best meals were the ones that fed both hunger and curiosity. We spent the next 6 months planning the expansion, working with architects and contractors to create a space that felt seamless despite serving two different functions. The bookstore would retain its cozy reading corners and community meeting areas, while the restaurant would offer intimate dining spaces and a larger room for events. My father taught me the practical side of food service. Inventory management, staff scheduling, health department regulations, and the thousand small details that keep a restaurant running smoothly. I brought my understanding of community building and event planning, along with a vision for how food and literature could enhance each other. The grand opening in September drew people from 3 counties, including food critics from the regional newspaper and bloggers who specialized in unique dining experiences. But the opinions that mattered most to me came from my regular customers, the people who had supported the Navigator from the beginning. Mrs. Patterson attended the opening night poetry dinner, where each course was paired with poems about the ingredients. She sat next to Jim the farmer, who had contributed haikus about the seasonal vegetables we were featuring. Miss Rodriguez brought her book club for the first official literary dinner, where we discussed like water for chocolate while eating Mexican-inspired dishes. Emma, now old enough to stay up for evening events, attended with her grandmother and declared the dessert inspired by children's poetry to be the most magical thing ever invented. But the moment that felt most significant came near the end of the evening, when my father stood up to make a toast. He looked around the room at the faces of friends and neighbors, at the walls lined with books and the tables full of people enjoying both food and conversation. My father came to this country with nothing but the belief that America was big enough for all kinds of dreams, he said, raising his glass. Tonight I see his granddaughter proving him right. To Sofia, who built something that serves both the stomach and the soul. As people applauded and raised their glasses, I felt the same sense of completion I'd experienced 5 years earlier in this same church. Not the completion of arriving somewhere, but the completion of understanding that the journey itself was the destination. Later, after the last customer had gone home and the staff had finished cleaning, I sat alone in the quiet restaurant with my grandfather's compass on the table beside me. The needle pointed north, as it always had, steady and sure despite everything that had changed around it. I thought about the letter he'd written for his funeral, about his words regarding treasures not being where you think you buried them. I'd thought the treasure was independence, the right to choose my own path without family interference. But the real treasure had been learning that independence and connection weren't opposites, that honoring family could coexist with honoring yourself. The Navigator Literary Cafe became something I hadn't fully anticipated, a bridge between generations, a place where my grandfather's legacy and my own vision could thrive together. Families brought their children for story brunches where picture books were paired with kid-friendly meals. Teenagers gathered for poetry slams, where appetizers were served alongside spoken-word performances. Adults joined book clubs that met over carefully crafted dinners, inspired by the novels they were reading. My father and I worked together more closely than we ever had, but as partners rather than as a reluctant daughter and a disappointed father. He handled the business operations while I focused on programming and community outreach. We disagreed sometimes about priorities and procedures, but we'd learned to argue constructively, to see different perspectives as assets rather than threats. On quiet Sunday mornings, I would sit in my mother's old reading chair with a cup of coffee and my grandfather's journal, reading his careful English sentences about building bridges between hearts and worlds. Through the windows, I could see Main Street coming to life, people walking past with their dogs and their newspapers, some of them stopping to look at the books displayed in my window. This was what home felt like when you chose it freely, not a place you were trapped by obligation, but a place you returned to because it nourished something essential in you. Not a limitation on your possibilities, but a foundation for building the life you actually wanted. The compass on my desk still pointed north, but I'd learned that true north wasn't a destination you reached and then stopped moving toward. It was a direction you kept following, adjusting your course as you learned more about the territory and more about yourself. My grandfather had been right about the treasure not being where you think you buried it. I'd spent years looking for it in distant places and independent achievements, when all along it had been here in Millbrook, waiting for me to become someone who could recognize it and claim it as my own. The last customer of that Sunday was a young woman about my age, who browsed the poetry section while eating a late breakfast. She looked familiar in the way that people from small towns often do, but I couldn't place her until she brought her book selection to the register. "Sofia Chen," she said. "I think we went to high school together." "I'm Rachel Morrison." I remembered her then, quiet, studious, someone who had always seemed to be observing the rest of us from a thoughtful distance. "Rachel, I heard you went to New York to work in publishing." "I did for 5 years, but I just moved back to take care of my mom, and I've been wondering what I'm supposed to do with my life now." She gestured around the restaurant. "This place gives me hope that coming home doesn't have to mean giving up your dreams." I rang up her book, a collection of contemporary poetry by women writers, and smiled at the echo of my own journey in her words. Sometimes coming home means you're finally ready to build the dreams you were always meant to build. As Rachel left with her book, and the promise to return for the next poetry night, I felt the satisfying certainty of having come full circle. The girl who had left Millbrook because she couldn't see how to be herself here, had become the woman who helped other people discover that they didn't have to choose between roots and wings. That evening, I locked the doors and walked upstairs to my apartment, where my grandfather's compass waited on the kitchen table beside my laptop, and the plans I was developing for winter programming. Tomorrow would bring new customers and familiar faces, new books to recommend and favorite dishes to prepare. The compass pointed north, true and steady, toward whatever was coming next. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged, moving in exactly the right direction, carrying both my family's legacy and my own dreams forward into a future I was finally brave enough to create. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.